Now, what I want to argue over today and tomorrow, and we'll talk about, is the idea that God can be a signifier for lack. And if I was to define radical theology in a nutshell, it would be that traditional theism says God exists. Standard atheism says God does not exist. Affirmation, negation. Radical theology says God is the inexistent thing, right? That negation itself has to be signified. And that for me is what's interesting about radical theology. That's why atheism, and Zizek talks about this, why atheism is not atheistic enough in its standard new atheist forms, is because it simply says God is nothing, not like Simone Weil says, God is the nothingness itself, right? Which is a traditional definition of God. You go back to Anselm. Anselm says God is that than which none greater can be conceived. Meaning God is not the greatest conceivable thing, because then you could conceive something greater than God, which is something that cannot be conceived, right? And Anselm says you cannot conceive of anything greater than God, because that's the definition of God. So if God can be conceptualized, then you can think of something greater than God. So Anselm's traditional definition of God is God as this greater than conception, which means God is a signifier for something that cannot be signified. So that's even within standard theology, God is a signifier for what cannot be signified. However, that in mysticism is defined as there's a hyper meaning that we just don't have access to. What I want to discuss with Barry today is, what does it mean to say that God can be a signifier for a fundamental lack, and that is woven into everything, not just subjectivity, but in mathematics, in biological life, and in physical being itself. And it's this lack that is generative. So if you take something like Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which, right, mathematically, I'm not going to pretend I understand. I understand enough to bastardize it, right? But one of the things that what you see in Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and the reason why I mention this is because Roger Penrose, a physicist, uses this, but is it that Gödel kind of says that any mathematical system of sufficient complexity has something that is true but not provable, a truth that is not provable. And there's a mathematician, Rudy, somebody, I forget his surname, who gives this analogy. Imagine a universal truth machine that can calculate anything that's possible to calculate. It can, so anything that's provable, you can put it into this machine. And technically everything, let's imagine the total system of nature is in principle provable. Laplace is kind of like God. Like if you have an infinite mind, you can know everything. If you know the position and the velocity of every subatomic particle, you can know everything. So you've got this machine, but then you create a statement that says A, so little a, which I'm going to objet petit I think is connected. That's why I want to use the term A equals the universal truth machine cannot prove that A is true, right? You put this into the machine can't prove it's true, because if the machine proves it true, then it's not true. And so it's true, but not provable. And so what Gödel kind of shows is the total system of nature does not have an exception, which we can call God. Technically, the masculine logic, God is the exception to the total system. Someone like C.S. Lewis has that. But rather, there is an exception to the total system that is within the system. It's true, but it's not provable. Now, Roger Penrose uses that to say, well, this is similar in quantum mechanics, is there's the deterministic universe. And then there's this world of pure potentiality, wave oscillations, et cetera, that crunch down into something. And he says, what is it that crunches the wave oscillations into an actual thing? And he calls it proto-consciousness. I think we can call it proto-unconsciousness is a better term. But proto-unconsciousness is that the universe has within it, and within its total system, it generates an exception. But the exception is not outside, the exception is within. That's kind of my definition of God.